Hey everyone, welcome to Cuplet Fern, Florida Native Plant Society. My name is Mark. I have the great pleasure of having George Gann here with us. I'll go through my announcements really quickly and then turn things over to George so he can get his presentation started with you all. So welcome to Cuplet Fern, Florida Native Plant Society. Our mission is the conservation, preservation, and restoration of Florida native plants and native plant communities, which happens to be the program for tonight. So it's very, very right and timely for us. This video will be available on our YouTube channel. So in case you are watching through Facebook, you can go ahead and subscribe to youtube.com/cupletfern. Matter of fact, I have it pulled up here. There's a vast library of webisodes, past programs, etc. And if you are tied up on a Monday night and you would like to revisit this program, please go ahead and click subscribe, which is the red button right here. And Cuplet Fern members, please report your volunteer hours. So if you are a member, please email me at cupletfern@gmail.com if you need the link. If you are a long-time member, you already have the link saved as a bookmark on your browser. Please continue to report your volunteer hours even during COVID. And just so you guys know, we volunteered over 1,200 volunteer hours last year, and that is valued at over $25,000. And if I were to wager, it would be far more than 1,200, but 1,200 was at least reported by Cuplet Fern. So you guys should be very proud of yourselves. And Cuplet Fern spring outreaches are here. So let's go through them. And this is just until mid-March. So hang tight, follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. We have in-person events as well as ticketed online events, as well as free virtual events. So there's something for everyone. The first up is Weed Wrangle, and that is a nationwide campaign that is occurring right now until February 28th, the end of the month. And they are covering lots of different invasive plants. This year's Weed Wrangle campaign is Weed Wrangle at home, given this current pandemic situation. So Japanese climbing fern, coral ardesia, arrowhead wine, catclaw wine, alligator weed, all these types of weeds can be found in urban areas, and we encourage you to pull them out. Follow us on Facebook. Each day actually has a new highlighted invasive plant that is commonly found in urban areas. And this year there are prizes. So just follow the instructions and you have a chance to win one of 4 uprooters, which is basically a weed whacker that can pull weeds out efficiently from your lawn or green space. And then you also have a chance of winning one of 4 native plant gift certificates that are valued at $25 each. So it's a pretty cool initiative. Follow us on Facebook for Weed Wrangle. All right, and then on Thursday, February 25th, we have Aquatic Butterfly Gardens, which are with our wonderful director at large, Lee Ecto. And she'll be sitting down with Sean Patton from Stalking Savvy to discuss some beautiful aquatic plants that also happen to be excellent pollinator plants. This one pictured here is pickerel weed. Another one that they'll be discussing is buttonbush. And I believe they'll also be discussing spider lily, which is Hymenocallis latifolia. So that's Thursday, February 25th. 4 p.m. and it's virtual. It's visible to all on Facebook as well as YouTube. And the Seminole IFAS is actually having their online virtual expo. Usually it's in person and we're attending and we're presenting and we have a small plant sale there. But due to the current situation, it's all virtual. It's online on February 27th from 9 a.m. until 4:15 p.m. And I will go ahead and copy and paste the link for you guys to register into the chat box momentarily. And, the most important one of all is the plant sale. Everybody's been asking about it, demanding one, quite frankly, badgering me for, when is the next plant sale? I got to get my plants. I got to get started on gardening. So here it is. March 6th, 9 a.m. to 1 p.m., Sanford Garden Club. That's at 200 Fairmont Drive, Sanford, Florida. If you happen to be a Cuplet Fern member, then we have already sent you pre-sale, pre-order pickups, and you can follow us through there. But that is only for Cuplet Fern members. But for the general public, you guys can come in 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. and check out the wide variety of plants that we will have. Our next program is a webinar with Dr. Bruce Snyder from the Georgia College and State University with his colleagues Matt Callahan and Sam James. They'll be talking about native earthworms, which is a super rare topic, highly interesting, rather obscure. Nobody knows about native earthworms as much as they do about native plants. So they're going to shed some light on native earthworms. And believe it or not, our native earthworms are very dependent on fire regimen. So they'll be discussing that as well. March 8th, 7 p.m., virtual again, free for everybody, Facebook and YouTube. And on March 13th, which is Saturday, at 3 p.m., we will have a table talk with our wonderful director at large, Jennifer Hopton-Villalobos. She'll be talking about new natives in the garden. And, gardening is not about control. It is an experiment that you work with, what unfolds, learning from successes and failures. And Jennifer will be sharing some growing tips and characteristics of native plants in the spring garden. And last but not least, this is a very, very special event. It's a native plant experience for plant art, especially eco art, and it's celebrating eco printing by a Texan artist called Mary Catherine Kramer. And Mary's line of thinking is very, very unusual. She incorporates the concepts of co-creating, inner listening, and experimenting with typical plants found around your home this time of the year, so they're easy to harvest. And then you can also harvest some invasive plants that may be put to good use before they are trashed. She will be discussing many plant options, pH for best printing, the chemical reaction that takes place during the plant process. And here's some pictures just to get y'all more interested. So this is one of the products of eco art printing using native plants. Here's another one. Here's the process itself. And I actually have a video of it. So let's play that really quickly and listen to what Mary has to say.
On the garden in me. If I listen to my inner nature, what does it tell me? Am I giving it what it needs? How do I love and give compassion to myself? How do I find what is miraculous about my garden? Is it a garden of delight? I see all of it as part of me. I accept into me that energy, color, and healing vibration from the plants I utilize. The water I use nourishes, hydrates, and exchanges energy to co-create with these beings of plants and their energies. How do I farm the garden inside of me? What does my heart tell me? I love that their inner beings are reflected in the outer world, and my inner beings are reflected as well. These plant energies within us and our energies within them are all part of one big circle.
So I just wanted to show you guys that she is a very spiritually inclined woman. And if you are interested in something like this, please go ahead and purchase the tickets. And I will have that in the comment box very shortly. So come grow with us. Cuplet Fern is very active. I've highlighted virtual learning here. That has been our strongest outreach right now, given the circumstances. But we are hoping to get more involved in our community with events and workshops and field trips once this is all behind us. And you can go to fnps.org and click join. And then you can select Cuplet Fern. There are student, individual, household, and business level memberships. Matter of fact, this is the page right here. You can scroll down and there's a chapter, and then you can select Cuplet Fern. And this is in case you are in our area. Our area is expanding. We are now in Seminole, West Volusia, and basically all the North Orlando suburbs that bleed into Seminole County. So, as well as extreme North Brevard in the MIMS area. So, do go ahead and go to fnps.org/join and look for us there. And tonight, without further ado, we have George Gann, and he'll be talking about the restoration of native plants and native plant communities from theory to practice. So I'm going to hand things over to George, and he can introduce himself to you all.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Let's see if I can. All right. Are you? Oh, wait. Okay, hold on. Sorry, folks. This is a new. This is a new format here for me. How about that? Mark, what do you see?
I see you in presentation mode, so you're good to go.
All right, excellent. All right, thanks everybody for being here this evening, and I'm looking forward to giving this presentation. And we're just going to jump right in. I'll talk a little bit about myself and IRC as we go through the presentation. I want to start off with some acknowledgments to thank Mark and the chapter for having me here this evening, giving me the opportunity to talk on behalf of IRC and SER and our work. And to just say that the things I'm going to talk about are really the product of the work of many, many people. So just keep that in mind that literally dozens to hundreds of people have contributed to the various things that we're going to talk about here today. Many photographers have donated their work or made their work available to us for our websites and for our presentations. So I want to thank them. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the Pine Rockland Initiative, Restoring the Gold Coast and Native to Your Neighborhood. And I wanted to thank the people that work on those programs and our sponsors and collaborators. So what I'm going to try and do this evening is talk a little bit about my work and IRC and our mission, then talk about native plant conservation context. I'm going to be focusing on South Florida since that's where most of my work is, but the things that I'm going to talk about are relevant to your part of the world as well. Then some restoration theory and policy, and then talk about a couple of projects that I think demonstrate how that IRC thinks about and does restoration work. And then if all is well, then we'll have some time for some conversation at the end. So I wanted to start off by just saying that I'm originally from Miami-Dade County. I currently reside in Delray Beach, and I consider this my neighborhood. Almost all the restoration work that I've done in the field has been in South Florida and some in a little bit further north in Florida. But I also do a lot of floristics work, including projects in Puerto Rico and the Bahamas and the Yucatan. So my thinking about native plants is broader than just Florida. I do work on global and local policy, and kind of the space that I'm interested in is how to develop global policies that are actually useful on the ground at the local scale, and also how to communicate what we learn at the local scale up to policymakers, whether that's the state or the national or international. And so that's the kind of area that we're going to talk a little bit about today. Not to go into the details, but I've been doing ecological restoration work for a long time. And although most of my work has been in Southern Florida, I've worked on a whole bunch of different kinds of ecosystems, worked on the propagation of native plants and rare species, invasive species removal, fire, all sorts of things, all sorts of different ecosystems over the years. I've also thought about restoration from a bigger kind of landscape scale. For example, discussing the issue that the Everglades restoration, one of the biggest and most expensive projects in the country, if not the world, doesn't have performance measures for biodiversity. And to try and get people to start thinking about incorporating biodiversity into the restoration planning process a little bit more. So in terms of IRC, we're based in Delray Beach. We were based in Miami for a long time. We work principally in South Florida, but also elsewhere in Florida. And our aim is really to prevent local extinctions of native plants, animals, and ecosystems. And we do that through protection, restoration, and management. We've been around for a while, a little over 35 years. We have a staff of 7, most of us part-time. 12 associates and 7 board members, and we work on a whole bunch of different things, all related, including floristic and faunistic inventories, rare species research, ecological restoration design and implementation, education, online tools, and international policy. So those of you who know a little bit about us know that we like to produce resources that people can use that are effective and approachable, and that are largely free. And so we have websites. We produced a book, Rare Plants of South Florida, pamphlets, and all sorts of different things, in addition to webinars and lectures and all kinds of things like that. And then I mentioned work in the Caribbean. So we also have websites, bilingual site on Puerto Rico, and then 2 very busy Facebook pages on in the Yucatan and Puerto Rico as well. When we talk about restoration, we have a professional restoration crew. It's small but mighty, but we also try and couple our restoration work with community outreach, because our feeling is that if we don't build community support for restoration projects, if people don't understand them and can't participate in them, then in the long haul, those projects are not going to be successful. And we work on international policy work with our partner, the Society for Ecological Restoration. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the work that we're doing there. All right, so the native plant conservation context is as follows. So South Florida, the gray area in the bottom, and all of Peninsula, all the rest of Florida and Southeast is now part of the North American coastal plain global hotspot. And so that's an area where we have high levels of endemism and also high levels of threat. South Florida used to be part of the Caribbean hotspot, was dropped, and then later this new global hotspot was proposed. So we have a lot of important species and ecosystems that we're interested in protecting and restoring. One of the interesting things about Florida, this is true of South Florida and all, but also further to the north, is that we have the southern and northern range limits of many species. So we have species, temperate species that come down into Central and South Florida, and then also tropical species that their northern range limits are in South or Central Florida. County area, for example, a temperate species that's near its southern range limit is almost alata or winged elm, and then the orchid Eulophia alta is a tropical species that ends about in your area. Here's another example of a tropical species that's very abundant in South America and Central America, and just barely makes it into Florida. And you see these kinds of range extensions. Your Cuplet Fern is another example of this, of species that barely make it into Florida, and you have these disjunct populations a little bit further to the north. In South Florida and Central Florida, we have endemics. There are new species being named every day, but the endemic species are an important part of the flora. But we also have widespread species that people may not be aware of or pay much attention to, like this black bog rush, which is actually more common in Europe, but is native and part of important ecosystems in Florida. So from the IRC perspective, the important matter is that local biodiversity matters. So it doesn't really matter how rare or common a species is elsewhere in the world. We certainly want to make sure that we take care of our endemic species, but we're really interested in creating conservation systems that protect or restore all of the native species in the areas where we live and work. And so this isn't just an example of very rare species that are native to tropical hammocks in Everglades National Park. And it just kind of gives you an idea of the kinds of biodiversity that we're talking about. There's all sorts of species. Every group is represented: trees, shrubs, vines, orchids, grasses, forbs, wildflowers, you name it. There are rare species that are part of the local biodiversity. And we also know that plant biodiversity is the key to animal biodiversity and vice versa. If we don't have healthy native plant communities, then we won't have the wildlife that we're hoping to have in our ecosystems. And without that wildlife, we will not get pollination and dispersal of native plants. If we look at the conservation system, this is South Florida, more than 50% of the area is in conservation. And that's great. The current United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity target is 17%. So in theory, everything should be great. We have way more conservation area than is recommended, but it's not. And the reason is that the conservation system is not proportional to the ecosystems, that the conservation system largely protects wetlands and the upland areas where people tend to live, and the coastal areas where there's a lot of biodiversity are not well protected. And so those species suffer. And I just pulled up a map here of Central Florida, or a portion of it, and in your area, and it's the same kind of thing. It looks like there's a lot of conservation area, and it is, and you should be proud of that, and glad to have it. But the reality is that some species will not be well represented in this conservation system. And so that's a lot of the work that IRC does, to try and figure out which of the species are protected and which of the species are falling through the cracks. What we know is that fragmentation leads to local extinction. It's just math. It's basic science that over time, as we fragment things and create conservation areas, that species will fall out of the system. And we know that some species will go, or some species groups will grow faster than others. So in the case of butterflies, the Florida leafwing on the bottom left is an endemic butterfly that is barely holding on in Everglades National Park. It's been wiped out in all the fragments outside. Other butterflies will be more resilient. And the same is true of plants. And even some things that you might think are going to be very resilient and are going to remain in conservation areas, what we're finding is that even some of these widespread common species are beginning to drop out of conservation areas over time. And so this is one of the things that IRC works on, is to track extinctions and rarity, and we've been doing that in South Florida since the mid-1990s. Some of you may be familiar with the Floristic Inventory of South Florida that we began work on in 1995, and it's been online since 2001. So it's been one of the resources that's been online some of the longest. And we've continued to track species over time, and that influences the way that we think about ecological restoration. And in 2002, we wanted to know what was going on. How are plants doing in South Florida? We had this great conservation system, and some people said, well, we don't need all these little small conservation areas in the urban zone and so forth. So we said, well, let's document and figure out what happened. And what we found is that 25% of the native plant species in South Florida, so that's of about 1,450 species, about half of the Florida flora in South Florida, about 25% of those ranked as critically imperiled or extirpated using Heritage Program criteria. We also found that about 8% of the South Florida flora was presumed or possibly extirpated or extinct. Over the 20 years that has now passed since we published that book, we've continued to look for these species, and we've gotten the list down from 8% to 6%. But my suspicion is that over time, that we have lost some additional things, and that 6% will begin to rise again toward 8%. We've also documented some global extinctions as early as 2002 that have now been published as part of a paper on global extinctions in North America and Canada. And despite all the work we have done, this is an example of a species that until just recently has fallen through the cracks. So this is something that we documented as possibly extirpated in South Florida, but there were these other records further north in Florida, which was outside of our initial scope. And until we started working on this North American extinction paper, I hadn't looked at the species in a long time. But the reality is that species like this that have scattered occurrences, often no one is paying attention to them because they figure, well, it must be doing well somewhere else. And the reality is, in this particular case, that the last record of collection is in 1989, actually a germplasm collection by USDA in Sarasota. So this is a species endemic to Florida that may be globally extinct. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears and we're going to talk about restoration a little bit. Now that we have the idea of what it is that we're trying to protect. And so 2021 through 2030 has been designated as the decade on ecosystem restoration. And many people, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people have now been working on restoration projects all over the world for the last 30 plus years. And so this decade on ecosystem restoration is great, and we're happy for it. But it also points out that there's danger in scaling up really large concepts like ecological restoration. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Partly in response to some earlier programs like the Bond Challenge, carbon sequestration projects, et cetera, SER and IRC and partners developed some international standards for ecological restoration, initially launched in 2016, and then the second edition was launched in 2019. And we're going to talk a little bit about the standards because they influence the way that I think about ecological restoration and the way that IRC tries to do it. But I want to point out that this document is based on incredible collaboration, 16 authors from 7 countries and 5 continents, and it was developed over a 3-year period following an intense review process of the initial standards. And some of the issues that we tried to wrestle with is which targets. So when we talk about restoration of native plant communities or habitats, this issue of which target, what are we trying to get to? What degree of recovery is possible? Are we trying to plant things? Are we trying to use natural recovery and so forth? And there were really 2 main camps that emerged in this process. And one was that ecological restoration should be inclusive at all costs, that we had to include all sorts of activities that people called restoration, but others said, no, the most important thing is to raise the bar. We need to encourage people to do the best possible restoration that we can do. And so we tried to bridge all of that and come up with some standards that we felt would address both of those concerns. So briefly, I just want to talk about the 8 principles that underpin ecological restoration. We're not going to go into any detail on these, but I just want to make you aware of them. But these are really important principles when you're thinking about designing and implementing restoration projects or programs. And so they include engaging stakeholders and drawing on all kinds of knowledge. And importantly, and this was a difficult issue actually in negotiations, was the Principle 3, that ecological restoration is informed by native reference ecosystems while considering environmental change. And we'll come back to that in a minute. But this is really important, that ecological restoration as a practice is based on the idea of restoring native ecosystems. We want to support ecosystem recovery processes, that our projects are assessed against clear goals and objectives, that we seek the highest level of recovery possible given our circumstances, that the more restoration we do, the more cumulative value it has, and that restoration is part of a continuum of restorative activities. So one of the things I want to talk about is that over time, you may have heard this or been part of these kinds of conversations, is the issue of, do I have to restore the ecosystem was actually on that spot of land? And the answer is no, that certain things change. So freshwater wetlands might be overwhelmed by sea level rise and become salt marshes and so forth. So that we have to adapt to those kinds of changes, whether they're climate change or they're changes to salinity or other kinds of changes, that we need to be responsive to that and choose a native reference ecosystem that we can actually restore on that site. And that's really important for restoration, especially in places like in urban environments, for example, where the conditions are really quite different from what might have been there historically. And so here's an example also of a kind of thing that you can include within concepts of ecological restoration, such as this green clay wetland on the edge of the Everglades. It probably was a sawgrass marsh, but these native ecosystems, these cypress domes and these emergent marshes were used as references, and this is an incredibly productive habitat, even though its main purpose is to treat wastewater. So we want to be really broad in our thinking about what is ecological restoration, or what is the restoration of native plant communities, and think about it in a very broad way, but still use the native ecosystems of the area as our reference models. Also importantly are the key ecosystem attributes. That what happens is that I'm a plant guy, another person is an animal person, somebody else works on invasive species and so forth. And so what happens is that often when we do ecological restoration projects is that we become siloed. We are paying attention to the part of the restoration project that we know something about or we're good at. And so the standards really try to get us to think about all of the different aspects of the ecosystem, from the threats to the ecosystem or its species, the physical conditions, the species composition, the structural diversity and functions, and how it interacts with areas outside of our particular restoration project. The standards also introduce the ecological recovery wheel and a 5-star rating system that allows us to evaluate where we started from and where we want to head in our restoration project. And again, this wheel really forces us to think about all aspects of the ecosystem. We can't just think about the thing that we normally think about, like invasive species control or the reintroduction of fire or planting native plants. We really need to think about where are we heading with this project and all of the different aspects of the ecosystem. So for example, we'll talk a little bit about this project later on, but in urban areas, we often have poor connectivity. And so there's nothing that we can do about that in many circumstances, but in some circumstances we can. So barrier islands and beach dune and coastal strand systems are often highly connected. And so here's an area where in one part of the urban zone, we might be able to do very well in terms of connectivity, but in other parts of the urban zone doing restoration, we're not ever going to get that. We also might lose or gain certain species. Like we're not probably going to get the highest trophic level predators here. We're not going to get panthers outside of Delray Beach on the dune, but further north we might. So we just want to pay attention to the environment that we're actually working in and adapt our planning to that reality. We also introduced the restorative continuum. So one of the things we want to be really careful about is becoming or being elitist about our project. So I planned and I did the best restoration project ever, and this project down the street, that's not so good. Well, there might be a reason why it's not so good. There might be limiting factors, a lack of money or technology, or it might be a difficult ecosystem to work on and so forth. So we want to be really inclusive of things that will move things in the right direction. Anything that gives us net gain and ecosystem functionality and biodiversity and integrity is to be embraced. So anything that moves us is in the right direction, we want. Anything that moves us in the wrong direction or causes collateral damage, like planting trees and biodiverse grasslands, is not restorative. And we don't want to call that restoration in any way, shape, or form. So this is a great tool for people to think about how they can participate in restoration in all sorts of different circumstances. As plant people, I want to also point out there's an appendix in the standards that talks about genetics and climate change and provenancing, and it might be worth looking at because we have to deal with the fact that we have climate change, and that even though in the past many people promoted the idea of local provenancing only, that we need to be thinking a little bit more about what's happening with, for example, tropical species that are moving north and temperate species that are retracting their ranges, and what kind of genetic material that we want to use for our projects. All right, so now I'm going to talk about a couple of IRC restoration projects. They're both in South Florida, but I think that the idea, the way that we're going to go about these is will be interesting and hopefully applicable to other parts of the state. So pine rocklands are basically mesic flatwoods or wet flatwoods that grow on limestone in Miami-Dade and Monroe counties. There's also some small amounts of pine rocklands in the Big Cypress Swamp. And the Pine Rockland Initiative was started about 15 years ago, initially to provide support for private owners of pine rocklands. But it's grown over the 15 years and now includes all kinds of activities related to the restoration and management of pine rocklands. Very briefly, you see these kinds of graphs for different ecosystems in different parts of Florida. And so you see this, there's very little data actually of what we started with, and there were really no measurements until everything was almost gone. But what we know is that we have about 2% or less of the original pine rockland footprint that appears to be still with us. So Miami, downtown Miami would be kind of in the upper right-hand corner of your screen here. And so one of the things that's really important about restoration and about these kinds of ecosystems is that they're not the same over space, that different, just small changes in Florida, just small changes north-south or east-west can really influence the flora of an area. And so I'm saying, for example, that, well, we have pine rocklands in Everglades National Park, and we don't really need to restore or manage pine rocklands in Everglades National Park and or outside of Everglades National Park. And the reality is that the floras are completely different. They're endemic species that are only outside of the park and so forth. And so work in all of these different areas is needed. And some of the drivers of degradation include fire exclusion, hardwood and palm expansion, overly dense canopies of pine trees, and of course, invasive species. On Big Pine Key, you have to add sea level rise and storm surge and other kinds of climate-related and sea level rise-related problems to this ecosystem. And so it's a truly an imperiled ecosystem. There are 24 different species of federally listed plants and animals and dozens of state-listed species that are dependent on this ecosystem. And so after losing ground for many, many years, we, a bunch of collaborators got together and said, we need to do something. We need to think about this in a different way because we're not getting the funding, we're not getting the fire on the ground, we're not getting the invasive species controlled, et cetera. And so we came up with some ideas like expanding the footprint, that we don't want to just hold our ground. We want to, double the footprint of pine rocklands. We want to get back some of what we've lost, and creating this pine rockland business plan idea to try and figure out, well, what would it actually cost if we had the money that we need to restore all of the remaining pine rocklands and so forth. So I gave a talk a few months ago, and I'm just going to go through some of the ideas that we discussed very quickly. One of those is that we need to rethink what a pine rockland is. So this is a mapping project that we did in the mid-2000s. And under the regulatory environment at the time, the area, even though it had Brazilian pepper on the right, and certainly the area behind the person walking would have been treated as a pine rockland, but the area that was mowed to the left would not have been. But there's actually probably much more pine rockland diversity in that mowed area than there is in the area with the tires and the Brazilian pepper. So in the mapping, that was ignored, and that was a mistake in our opinion. And so now we need to go back and try and figure out where all of that pine rockland is that we did not map years ago. we want to make sure that all intact and restorable pine rocklands are protected from here on out. And that includes these kinds of private sites where the pine rockland was scraped away with a bulldozer, but it still has the ground cover, and making sure that politicians don't sell publicly owned properties. We've talked about fragmentation, and we know fragmentation is really bad. But politicians, once we degrade things to a certain extent, the idea is that those are gone. So here's an example of, this is the Richmond Pine Rockland. It's the largest tract of pine rocklands outside of Everglades National Park. And that parking lot in the center of the photo on your left-hand side of the screen is about to become a water park. But it's surrounded by good pine rocklands at the Metro Zoo and other surrounding areas. And so we argued that we could restore that. And so the idea is that with restoration and restoration thinking is that we don't want to lose the potential to defragment, to reconnect these pieces of important ecosystems that maybe they're under pavement, maybe they're under a road, or maybe they're under old buildings. But really, we need to be more ambitious in terms of telling politicians that this is important, and losing or causing more urbanization in areas that are already fragmented is bad news. All right, we want to burn whenever possible, and Miami-Dade County has been doing an excellent job of getting fire on the ground in really small fragments, patches in the urban zone, and figuring out exactly how we can get this done. We have to support both public and private conservation efforts. In this particular ecosystem, every square foot matters. We're down to 3,000 acres out of 160,000 outside of Everglades National Park. So every bit matters. We want to document potential for natural recovery. We erroneously thought for years and years that pine rocklands were very sensitive, and once they were damaged, they could never be restored. And that just was not based on facts, because you can go to places like the fire breaks in Everglades National Park, and they're full of pine rockland species. And we're looking at other sites now where we can see this kind of recovery after damage, and that there is actually a lot of potential. Identifying all the restoration opportunities that are out there, and that includes both the extent, that is expanding the footprint, and also the quality or integrity of the pine rocklands that are degraded or transitional. So for an example, this is an area next to one of the IRC pine rocklands that was bulldozed by the owner. I guess this was probably a year or so ago. It doesn't really matter. But the idea is that to most people, they would say, oh, well, that's now been destroyed. And isn't that a shame? But really, that was a Brazilian pepper thicket before they bulldozed it. And maybe they did us a favor. Maybe this is actually a restoration opportunity. So we need to think really broadly when we see things like this about, well, can this actually help us move things in the right direction? Support restoration in the urban zone. So for a whole bunch of reasons, whether it's connectivity or for pollinators or for education, supporting restoration of native plant communities in the urban zone, in my mind, is super important. And that we also need to do it in a way where it's aesthetically pleasing, and we're reaching out to stakeholders and making sure that we do it in a way that actually is going to be helpful. And so one of the things that we're doing is creating guidance for this kind of thing, and including Natives to Your Neighborhood, and then also a pine rockland planting guide. Also, we don't want to be afraid to trial new tools and techniques. So again, in Miami-Dade County, we had this perspective that we couldn't use machinery. The soil was too sensitive and so forth. But that was a Brazilian pepper thicket on the left and a Biden's patch on the right. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had been using some machines on Big Pine Key. And so we tried those. And I know that machines can be absolutely the wrong thing, and they're overused in certain parts of the state. But for us, in this particular circumstance, it was a technique that we hadn't used. And what we found was that species actually responded pretty well. That we could, with the right, doing it in the right way, recover some of the ground cover that we were losing ground to by using machines in areas where we just would never be able to afford to do the restoration by hand. We're also trying to look a little bit outside the box. So one of the things that has happened in pine rocklands is that the palm cover of saw palmettos has expanded. We think it should be somewhere around 25%, but in some patches it's now 80 or 90% cover. So when that happens, we lose the graminoid community, we lose the open patches of sand that's important to listed species, both plants and animals. And so we've been trialing the reduction of saw palmetto, and in some cases with great success. So this is still early in the process, but again, we're trying to think really broadly about restoration and learn as we're going along. We also thought that we could not use direct seeding. The competition from weeds would just be too much and would overwhelm any effort. But we had some areas at Sock South near the Homestead Air Reserve Base that were just really a mess, and we weren't getting any recruitment, and we were not going to. So we decided to do some different kinds of trials, and we're having great success in creating these little islands of native grasses and forbs from which they are now expanding. And then to develop measurable targets and document success. So looping back around to the SER standards, understanding a little bit better what was the historical condition, using historical information, or using reference ecosystems like in Everglades National Park in the photo below, to figure out a little bit better what's our actual target when we're dealing with these patches of forest in the urban zone, for example. Where should we be heading? And then I'll close this section with just a little time sequence of some restoration at the Southern Command Center next to Homestead Air Reserve Base. And in some cases, so in here on the upper left, we had gotten rid of most of the invasives, and but we couldn't get fire on the ground. And so the native hardwoods basically started just taking over, and we were losing ground. So in July 2018, we started removal, and you can see down in January 21, it's a completely different story. So you can get great results in very short periods of time if you're using the right techniques and have the right targets. All right, so now we're going to talk about restoring the Gold Coast. So this is a coastal project, and this is completely different from the Pine Rockland Initiative. So in this case, southeastern Florida, from about Key Biscayne to West Palm Beach, almost the entire dune system had eroded into the sea or was under pavement or houses by around 1970. So the entire system was just washed away. And there were some small pockets of biodiversity and some parks and people's abandoned lots and yards and so forth. And what we know, and this is true of Florida, you know, we love re-nourishing beaches, and we know how to do it pretty well. And so we move sand, and we know how to plant sea oats and a few other species. And people have done a great job of recovering sea turtles. One of the interesting things that I've noticed over the several decades that I've been doing coastal restoration work is that projects in the 1980s and early 90s were actually more ambitious in many cases in terms of plant diversity in these big projects. And so now it's just a handful of species that are planted in many cases. So what we know, what we want to promote is the idea that a diverse dune is a healthy dune, and it's our first line of defense against sea level rise and other kinds of hooks that we can get people interested in restoring biodiverse dune systems. And so we'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment, but this is an example from Delray Beach, which has had a long series of restoration projects that have been going on over several decades. And so what we know is that the Delray Dune is loaded with rare plants. In the upper right-hand corner is beach cluster vine Jacqueminea reclinata, which is a state endemic. It's listed by the Fish and Wildlife Service as endangered, and that has been planted in this particular location. But the other three plants are recruits. So they are proof that if you can restore the basic functionality of the ecosystem, the basic structure, that natural recovery can occur and move the process forward. But what we found is that even though the Delray Dune was super diverse, if you compared it to projects around or further to the north, and certainly in Broward, there were still lots of missing species. So in 2015, we did a survey of the municipal beach at Delray and also at Atlantic Dunes Park, and we recorded 101 native dune species in, I guess it's about a mile, a little less than a mile of dune. It's a lot of species, way more than in most parts of the state where restoration has taken place. But there were some species that had been previously recorded that apparently dropped out of the system. And when we really looked at the historical records, there were an additional 75 species that were within the native range that we had identified through the Floristic Inventory of South Florida that were missing and could be restored into the area. And as we've done more work on this, we've found even more species. Our species list has grown because we're including things like coastal interdunal swales, the freshwater wetlands that used to be embedded in the dune system, and so forth. So we have a big, robust list of species that we want to see in the dunes or on the barrier islands that is documented using historical records. And we began to compile information and create resources that could tell the story of what had happened and what we were missing, and including some things, for instance, like Croton linearis that was native all the way up into St. Lucie County originally, and how that was the larval host for the Bartram scrub hairstreak, which is a federally listed butterfly, and so forth. Or in the lower right-hand part of your screen, the Florida prairie clover, which is now listed by the feds, that was collected only 2 times in Palm Beach in 1895 and 1918. So something that fell out of the system a long, long time ago that we could look at bringing back to the dune system. All right, so there's a whole bunch of different activities. I'm just going to go through some of them fairly briefly, but part of the project is to do an assessment. We want to see what's going on the ground. So this project goes from basically the Broward Palm Beach line up to Lake Worth. So I guess it's about 20 miles of coastline, and we're assessing about half of that. And we're looking for, what is the condition, what's protected, what's not, and so forth. And so there's some key coastal forests that are protected. Those are tropical hammocks that are in the backside of the dune, and that there are some grassy areas that intersect these forests, like this one in Ocean Ridge. But the coastal strand, the saw palmetto dominated system that existed between the Pioneer Zone and the Maritime Hammock has been almost completely obliterated. And this is where a great deal of the biodiversity is in the dune system. It's not all of it by a long shot. You've got plenty of stuff in the Maritime Hammock and in the coastal interdunal swales and so forth. But this is a really, really important part of this mosaic of ecosystems. And so now all of there are is just these tiny patches of saw palmetto, for example, in this private dune in Ocean Ridge. And on the left is a reference site from Volusia County to give an idea of what this system might have looked like at some time in the past. And what we're finding is that coastal strand is just being overwhelmed, or it's being destroyed. And in many cases now, the remaining pieces of coastal strand, the remaining saw palmettos, and this other species that are growing with them are being overwhelmed by a combination of invasive, non-native plants and sea grapes and a few other aggressive natives like coin vine and nickerbean. And this is the skeletons of dead saw palmettos on the right. And so if you read saw palmetto literature, those clumps of saw palmettos could be hundreds of years old, and they're just being overwhelmed by these aggressive species. And there's a public perception problem, an environmental education problem, actually. Just like Smokey the Bear, in this particular case, all of the environmental literature, the educational displays and so forth are weighted toward forests. They're weighted toward the Maritime Hammock. And you see on the left, there's almost no Pioneer Zone or coastal strand, the scrubby plants on the foredune. It's just not there. It's not the emphasis. So people think that the coastal strand was this tiny little thing. But if you look on the map on the right, this is Red Reef Park, the old Boca Hammock area. The white in the middle between the gray patches is the historical coastal strand. And so it was well over half of the the coastal uplands was coastal strand, and that's now completely gone. So we have a re-education issue to deal with because people love trees and people want to protect trees at all costs. And so the idea of that the sea grape canopy that is there now, and it's way too complex to talk about in this webinar about how that came to be, but the sea grapes that are there now are an artifact of planting and climate change and all sorts of other things, and that we actually need to reduce the height and the spread of sea grapes in order to get back some of the biodiversity that we have lost. And people are resistant to that. And so the whole issue of stakeholder engagement and education rise to the top. We have to take the time to explain to people what it is that we need to do and why it's important. And so that includes digging up historical photos and showing people, okay, hey, this was the dune system in Delray. Look at the salt palmettos, just like the historical photo of the Pine Rocklands. And you can see that that there was no sea grape forest there. And there are many other photos, lots of documentation of that. But you have to pull those out and you have to put them into a framework where you can explain them to people in a way that they'll be that they will understand and be receptive to the idea of this kind of change that you're proposing. So since 2018, we've been building a coalition of partners to reintroduce some of this lost biodiversity to the coastal system in southern Palm Beach County. This particular project, our ultimate aim is to take it throughout Palm Beach and down into Broward and Miami-Dade, and we can do similar projects, really anywhere in Florida. I mean, this is just an idea that will work anywhere where you've had a lot of urbanization on the coast and a lot of loss of coastal species. We were very successful at getting some funding to move the project going, looking for opportunities. Where can we do this work? And there's all kinds of opportunities, places where we can reintroduce biodiversity. But one of the really things that when we initially thought about this program, we were thinking more about planting. We were going to work in the established dunes and we were going to plant. But what we've actually found is that we're having to do spend a lot more time removing invasive species and dealing with sea grape issues in order to create the opportunities that we need to restore the biodiversity. It's also important to understand where you're not going to do work or where you're not going to plan to do restoration within a particular program. In our case, we're not going to try to deal with areas that have poor engineering, where people are putting their houses or buildings too close to the ocean, or areas that have active erosion. There are many, many people that can address these problems and are better qualified to do so. We need a stable dune system in order to do our work, and it's important for us to be able to say that. We're not going to do everything. We're just going to work in particular areas where we have a stable dune system. Just to give you an idea of some of the events, this was pitched and implemented as a community engagement project like we talked about. So we're talking about getting into the classrooms, into public venues, talk to people about the importance of this program, but also getting students out to the dunes and getting community groups to engage in the projects and to help us plant some of this lost biodiversity. With COVID, we've had to pull back on what we can do with volunteers and engage professional restoration folks. And we've done that, also partnering with other institutions like Fairchild Tropical Botanic Garden, in this case, working on habitat for beach cluster vine. To date, we've planted over 50 different species of native plants that were depleted or lost from the dune system as part of this program, and we will be continuing this work into the future. We've also developed resources for private dune owners. So pretty much anywhere in Florida, there's a lot of protected dune systems, but the majority of it is in private hands. So we have to have a way of reaching out to private dune owners to encourage them to participate in the program and to restore some of the biodiversity on their own dunes. We're also linking the native plants that are part of this biodiversity restoration to butterflies and other wildlife, coming up with this idea of these butterfly starter kits, where the restoration of, or the planting of 4 larval host plants, for example, can bring in as many as 10 different coastal butterflies that have been documented from our area. We're also continuing to work on trialing and understanding restoration design, how we can think about where are we heading. And so in this example, the grassy beach has been planted a long, long time, but the salt palmettos are slow-moving species. There are no gopher tortoises to move them around or anything like that. So the expansion of salt palmettos back into this grassy area is extremely slow. But we can find a few plants here and there, and we can use those to say, okay, is this where the coastal strand should be? And so we're trialing the introduction of salt palmettos and some of the other species that are found a little bit further back in the dune to figure out exactly how far east that we can restore this particular ecosystem. We're also documenting as we're going through the project, as we're restoring, removing invasive species and reducing sea grape canopy. We're getting a lot of natural recruitment and discovering new species that hadn't been recorded in sites or in that part of Florida and the coastline. And so it's really important to do that, to document what you're finding and communicate that to people in a way that they can understand. All right, so we're going to close up here briefly talking about natives for your neighborhood. Okay, so the lesson that IRC has learned is that we must restore degraded ecosystems, small and large, fragmented, connected, that all of them are needed, and it's not enough, that we're going to need more in order to prevent losing more species. And so part of that is going to be in the urban environment, and we talked about that briefly. And if you look at it, people, there's all kinds of information that's available about native plants and wildlife data, what you can buy and what the ranges are and so forth. But a lot of this data is very coarse. It's, say, at the county level, or not even that in the case of the ecological revegetation application and so forth. And so we wanted to think about how can we better link national and local resources for native landscaping and restoration. And we're working on a national effort in that area, but also at a very, what we call hyper-local perspective, Natives to Your Neighborhood. So I know that many people know about Natives to Your Neighborhood. It's an application that we originally built for South Florida. If you haven't checked it out, you should. But the idea is that we use the historical data that we collected through the floristic inventory of South Florida and our restoration work, and it's very precise. It is producing lists of native plants within historical range at the zip code level. And this tool gets a lot of use. In 2020, we had 67,000 users and 750,000 page views. So it gets a lot of traffic and people are using it. And I'd encourage you to check it out if you haven't. Okay, but we're not in your area yet. Originally, this was a South Florida only application, but we are moving north. We've gotten some funding little bits of funding to do that. It's slow and steady process, but we are slowly moving into Central Florida for zip code level data. So I'll be in communication when we get that, we get done to your part of the world. And then, there's just a ton of information on Natives for Your Neighborhood, and many of the species that grow in your area are already on the website, so you can check it out. We're also compiling information on species further to the north. So you'll see some things on the list asking for help. We need photographs, we need cultural information, and so forth. So we're always looking for people to collaborate with. And if you think you have something to contribute to help us move Natives for Your Neighborhood to the north, then we would greatly appreciate it. In closing, for me, for IRC, for many of my colleagues, this is about playing the long game. This is about, what do we end up with in 30 years or 50 years or 100 years, that we're in the process of learning how to live with the planet, learning to reduce and ultimately, eliminate the disturbance and the degradation and the destruction of the environment, and turn a corner where we have a restorative relationship with nature and with native ecosystems, which is the way towards sustainability. All right, there we are. Thanks a lot, everybody. Mark, I'm really not sure what I'm supposed to do at this point.
Not a worry. You have questions coming in, folks. This is a good time to comment away your questions. Rhonda has actually posted her question, so we'll take it now. She writes, are you working with the climate mitigation and or adaptation programs?
So, sure. At both the local and the international levels, the issue of climate is super important. For one, to explain to people that in order for us to mitigate and adapt to climate change, we have to restore native ecosystems. Business as usual, just protecting what we have or planting trees and plantations or whatever, is not going to cut it. We have to deliver the restoration of ecosystems in order to accomplish this. Now, what I can say at the local level, for example, and this is important and something you all can work on in your part of the world, is that what I found is that the climate folks are still overly interested in gray infrastructure related to climate change. So things like repairing seawalls or elevating roads or all those things, which are all very important, but very few people are paying attention to the issue of climate change and biodiversity, that we need to understand better how our species going to move in relation to climate change. Do we have corridors set up so that they can migrate? Are we doing what we need to do? And are we investing in green infrastructure that is the restoration of ecosystems that can allow biodiversity to persist and evolve in the face of climate change? And this work needs everybody to pay attention to, because this is kind of like we're at the moment of recycling, right? We're thinking about climate change still in a very kind of mechanistic way, and we need to really be a lot more serious about the interplay between biodiversity and climate change.
Very good. Another question is, this is fantastic. Can you communicate how land is prepared for restoration when it has many invasive species?
Right. So it depends. It depends on where you are and what you want to accomplish. So that's the thing about the standards. It's an issue of understanding what your target is. What are you trying to get to? Because if you don't know what you're trying to get to, then you can't properly think about dealing with invasive species. So sure, there are some simple things like that pine rockland in the background there. If I found some Burma reed or Brazilian pepper, it'd be a simple thing to go in and eliminate those species if they were, say, less than 1% cover or less than 5% cover. But at some certain point, if you have a highly disturbed site, then thinking about what's going to happen when I remove these invasives, what's going to come behind them? Is it going to move things in the right direction, or am I going to move things in the wrong direction? Am I just going to set the clock back and spend a bunch of money, and then a whole nother suite of invasive species are going to come in? So it's really about understanding the ecosystem that you're working with, what its condition is, where are you trying to go with it, and then and only then can you really make a good decision about how to go in and treat invasive species.
Very good. George, you have quite a few questions, so I would recommend maybe some succinct answers and links and resources for people to research a little bit more. So Luna writes, can we restore longleaf pine savanna that used to be a golf course? This is a very general question, but one that is frequently asked by the public.
So longleaf pine, mesic flatwoods, pine rocklands, the issue of how to deal with nutrification of those systems that you would find in a golf course is an issue. There are people working on that. For example, at Disney Wilderness Preserve and other places, there's other folks that have worked on nutrified pine savannas, and it's difficult. But I think people are understanding it, and this is be something where you're going to need to go out and get help. I didn't Florida is fantastically rich in ecosystems, and I'm not an expert on all of them. So find local expertise.
Very good. Jonathan writes, do you have any recommendations for restoration of old field habitat where Bahia grass and Bermuda grass are the dominant grass species in what is now feral pasture land?
So again, what was it before would be a question that I would want to know, and where are you trying to go with it? And what else is there? I think, like in this kind of circumstance, I would want to know, what are the remnant native species that are there, and what are they indicative of? And could you carry fire, for example, in that particular area to drive the system towards, say, a savanna, or not? And so I think, just so that everybody is aware, this is where we would need to spend 5 to 10 minutes asking questions to get the detail in order to be able to give you the right answer, right? So this is complicated stuff, and so all I can do is help move things in the right direction.
Very nuanced question indeed. I'm going to take Jonathan's question again, and then I'm going to go back to some questions above in the comments section, but they're streaming in. So his other question was, do you believe that state park preserves should have initiatives to enhance aspects of their landscape, especially high traffic areas near parking lots and adjacent to trails, with native and appropriate plant shrubs that have aesthetic value and may be missing or extirpated from the landscape?
So I think it's really important to have environmental education opportunities at parks. I know that unless things have changed, state parks tend to have a very restricted view of what species that can be planted, and there are those that have been documented, at least in my part of the state, those that have been documented at the park. And that's not bad policy. But they are also would be open to bringing the plants that were previously recorded and putting them in the kinds of landscapes that you're talking about. What I find that goes in the wrong direction, though, is that a lot of what would be educational plantings in parks really diverge from the flora. They include species that are not native to that area or those habitats or those ecosystems. This really is quite common with things like butterfly gardens, for example, where people plant things that are really not from that park or that area or those ecosystems. And then really, what is the message that you are sending? What is the education value of that? And so I think that we have to be cautious about that, and that I would prefer to see those kinds of plantings be ecologically, to have high ecological fidelity. That if you're going to bring those species, especially rare species that use the system, into those aesthetic areas, that's great. But they should be the ones that actually could live in that park, that could actually be part of that landscape, that you could tell a story about. So, so the dahlia that was collected twice in Palm Beach, if we can find a place that we could bring that and bring it close to where people are going to be, near a trail or something, and have some signage and explain that would have high value. But planting another firebush or another whatever that would have been extremely rare or never present in that system, to me, goes in the opposite direction of what we're trying to do. Sorry, I know I'm not very good at short answers.
I agree. You happen to be the reason why I support local native plants, and there was a huge shift, a paradigm shift within me that moved from just supporting Florida natives and planting them no matter where they were naturally vouchered, to really honing down and promoting, prioritizing, and spotlighting native plants that are naturally vouchered to our county, to our zip code, to our region. And I've been on that bandwagon ever since. So let's take another question here. Evan writes, does fire ever play a role in environments that you describe?
Right. So the two the two ecosystems that I talked about, the pine rocklands and then the coastal strand, are both, well, let's take the pine rockland is very simple. That's a 2 to 7 year fire cycle, well documented, with decades of experience in Everglades National Park, reintroducing summer burning and lots of experience. People are learning more about fire in the urban zone and how to work with it there, and some things that are not going to happen. Like we're not going to reduce saw palmetto cover with a fire on a 2-acre patch because it's just not going to get hot enough. So we're still going to have to do some other things. But yes, that's easy. It's well documented and fairly well understood. Less so in the Florida Keys, though, actually. Important part of the Florida Keys, but the understanding of how frequent and how intense and so forth is not as well understood. Coastal Strand, the other system, this is an interesting story because people don't have fire in their mind when they're thinking about coastal strand or any kind of coastal savanna or that kind of system. But fire is the only explanation that those ecosystems exist. But they're poorly documented, they're poorly understood, but they are discussed in some earlier papers, like Dan Austin's paper on the Boca Hammock and the coastal strand there, that the only way that those would have been there would have been with indigenous burning, and this makes sense. So can we burn coastal strand in downtown Boca? Unlikely. So we have to think about, what does that mean? But there are other parts of Florida where coastal burning could take place, and I think needs more consideration.
Very good. Dr. Patrick Boland, the director of the UCF Arboretum, is here with us, and he writes, how do you work with local governments that have land but limited resources to move the needle for restoration?
Yeah, this is tough. Almost no one has the money they need to move the needle forward for restoration in many of these municipalities. One of the things that occurred in Florida, in South Florida for sure, but in other parts of Florida, is that there was a huge acquisition program or push in the 90s in particular. In some areas, different times in different areas, but we ended up with a whole bunch of patches of ecosystems in the developed areas managed by local governments with absolutely no resourcing. So one of the things we're trying to do with the expanding the footprint and the idea of the Pine Rockland Business Plan and things like that is that we have to get politicians to understand that, okay, we bought this land and now we need to resource taking care of it, because most of it has become degraded over time. That it's in worse condition today than it was when it was acquired. It's almost universal. There are some exceptions. There are great parks in the urban zone. But if you look at the whole picture, there's been a slow process of degradation, lack of fire, invasive species, loss of species from the systems, et cetera. And it's my belief that only through changing political minds is that going to be resolved. In the case of Pine Rocklands, we've described the problem as an order of magnitude problem. If we're spending $1 million a year right now with the 3,000 acres that we have, we need to be spending $10 million a year for several years to get things back to where they need to be, where we can actually reduce costs over time. So to me, the answer really is a political one. The other thing, and I'm sorry, this is a long response, but it's important. The other thing that I see happening, and this is very scary and disheartening, is that local government, when faced with a patch of land that's overwhelmed by invasive species, are starting to sell patch A to raise funds to restore patch B. And the reality is that in order to deal with climate change, in order to deal with sustainability, we cannot afford to lose another square foot of green space in urban and suburban environments. We need all of these patches. So this habit of selling a patch of land because it's overrun by exotics visually is perceived as not being restorable in order to raise funds to take care of something that you should have taken care of for the last several decades is bad business. And this is something that the Native Plant Societies and Sierra Clubs and Audubons and other organizations need to pay serious attention to, because as Florida gets more urbanized and that land becomes more valuable, there's going to be more and more political pressure to sell those properties in order to make money for local government. So there are exceptions. There are great governments doing great work, and there's great conservation areas, but this trend is really disturbing.
Yeah, politics across Florida is unequal, for sure. There are various different factions and various different political minds, and it depends on which county you live in also. Ida Curtis writes, are native plants being grown more commercially? We have issues with availability. I'll go ahead and answer that so we can move on to the rest of the questions. But yes, they are being grown. We are putting a more positive pressure on our native nurseries to grow more and grow a more varied selection, not just better blooming plants, but better plants that have the local phenology and probably preserve the local genealogy a little bit better. But yeah, they're growing, and they're growing fast, and small native nurseries are popping up everywhere. Damon Moore. Hey, Damon. Damon writes, can you comment on the SERP program for restoration practitioners?
Yeah, so Society for Ecological Restoration has a certified ecological restoration practitioner program. It's been going for a few years now. Several hundred people around the world have been certified. There are beginnings of governments beginning to request or require that certain kinds of projects hire SERP practitioners. It's a great program. I helped to write some of the content, and I would highly recommend anybody that has the time to invest in that. So absolutely. So go to ser.org and I don't remember exactly where it is on the navigation, but yeah, it's great. Damon, thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, I believe the application period is closed for this year, Damon, but definitely double check, as I was very tempted to apply myself. Morgan Lee writes, how do you feel about Amelia? Some believe it is to be invasive, as I believe she's talking about tassel flower. Some believe it is to be invasive, as others say it is native. Most all agree that it is positive as a pollinator. So she believes it's a good pollinator plant, which I've seen it myself. How do we decide what to do with this species? Because it is beneficial in one way, but harmful and possibly in another.
Well, Amelia is a genus of at least two different species that are non-native and are weedy. It is not the only example, but here's the deal. There are both native and non-native weeds that are great for pollinators. Biden's Spanish needles is a native one that is just great. But weeds are weeds. And so if they're not in a certain kind of situation, they can explode, they can take over and overwhelm other plants. And so I think you need to be very cautious about them and ask yourself, can I replace that with something else that serves the same purpose that is native? So one of the things that's really useful in thinking about this and about restoration and native plants and so forth is this idea of weediness versus conservativeness. And we won't go into the whole process, but there's a way of ranking species regionally, indicating, how likely are they to be a weed versus how likely are they to be in only intact ecosystems. And we talked about the restorative continuum and moving things in the right direction. And so here's what I will say about things like Amelia and other weeds, whether they're native or not. They're on the very low end of the spectrum of what is good, right? In terms of stability, of integrity, of evolution, of ecosystems. So every time we do something, weeds are probably better than bare ground, but in some cases they're not better than bare ground. In some cases, bare ground is needed for certain kinds of, ground nesting bees, for example. So anytime you can move things from one weed, or something that is, a level of always a weed, to something that is sometimes weedy, to something that is never a weed, move in that direction. If you can do that in your thinking, then you will be actually participating in a restorative process. But if you lose things that are conservative, letting them get overwhelmed by weeds, you're moving in the wrong direction. That's not net gain. That's not where we're trying to head. So be careful.
Agreed. Yeah, there's always a discussion between quote unquote, high performing non-native plants. Another good one is golden dewdrop, Duranta erecta. We get a lot of people staunchly supporting that plant because they see native bees, they see tons of butterflies, etc. But I think all native plant gardeners are on a journey to restore their green space. And it's important with programs like this that talk about native plant communities to actually understand that further and truly, truly embrace native plants. Jennifer writes, I volunteer on a local restoration project with FWC support. They've been pushed away by concerned citizens and supportive political leaders. How do you communicate herbicide use to concerned citizens? Have you experienced pushback?
Yeah, sure. I think that we should use herbicides only when we need to, but we need to be able to use them when we need to. And I think that we're going to see more and more pushback. What's happened with Roundup and the lawsuit and so forth is just increasing public scrutiny. Not all bad. And so I can tell you that in Miami-Dade County, for example, glyphosate has been banned for use on public in any county property. And so what that has done is cause people to, think about, are there alternatives? And in this case, mostly the all other alternatives are other herbicides, but it's leading people to think about other ways of dealing with things. So, for example, on some projects, we're looking at mowing. Can we do more mowing if we're trying to restore pine rocklands? Can we do more mowing and less herbicide? And the answer is yes, that we can. And so if we can reduce the amount of use, then people will appreciate that. In Boca Raton, they're looking at non-synthetic alternatives to certain kind of herbicides. And in some cases, we found that those non-synthetic organic herbicides work well on certain things, but not on others. So there's environmental education, but there's education for ourselves about understanding where people are coming from and being willing to look at all the alternatives. On the other hand, we can't tell people that we can resolve a problem that can only be fixed right now with herbicides, like treating Brazilian peppers in most of South Florida. You're just not going to be able to do that unless you either rip them out of the ground or use an herbicide. So we shouldn't make false promises either, or say that we can do things that we cannot do. But it's an education bit, and it takes a lot of effort. But we shouldn't be surprised. I think we're going to see more and more of this, and a lot of it is well-intentioned. But it's just like, people don't want to cut down sea grapes, and that's well-intentioned. But we have to work on it. We have to understand how to meet them and understand them, where they're coming from. Agreed.
The best way to communicate with one another, especially adults, is never to yell at them. Jennifer writes, thank you. So folks, we are wrapping things up here. Thank you so much for joining. I just want to pull up the Institute for Regional Conservation. It's regional.
I lost you there, Mark.
It's regionalconservation.org. So please go ahead and donate to George Gann's organization. And then in case you guys are interested in our YouTube channel, you can subscribe here. It's youtube.com/CupletFern. And then folks were commenting that they were not able to see the eco printing class. So I'm just going to paste the link for it. It is a once in a lifetime opportunity with Cuplet Fern. She is a very spiritual, native plant embracing person. And that component is also equally important as the scientific realm. So it's a more holistic approach to understanding and appreciating native plants. So Damon writes, always informative and motivating to hear George speak. Absolutely. So George, I just want to thank you and close the program with this wonderful comment from Damon. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Thanks a lot. Everybody have a good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.